Greetings and welcome to In-Depth. I'm Dike Rostant. Now, the School of Education at the UWI is hosting a Caribbean Deaf Education Conference that takes place in November. Even before that, though, there's one happening further afield, and that is taking place in Rome. It happens in July. To speak to that and more, the significance, impact, and possible outcomes of it, we have Dr. Paulson Skerrit. And naturally, we're very happy to have a sign language interpreter, and that takes the form of Mr. Terence Gopaul. Thank you very much for being here, gentlemen. And let me start off with you, please, Dr. Paulson Skerrit. It's been a little while since we've spoken, but I want you to give me, even before you talk about the events that are happening, give us a little basis or a little history, context of sign language in Trinidad and Tobago being used for education.
So at the School for Deaf, Cascade School for Deaf, sign language was introduced. Of course, in the initial years, it was pretty much signed English that was being used. And following influences from abroad, sign language was not encouraged in the School for the Deaf. In fact, we've heard from deaf students who went to the school during some research we were doing, where we tried to find the oldest deaf individuals who would have gone to school. They indicated that there are times when their hands were tied behind their backs, they were not allowed to use sign language in the classroom. But as you know, with many deaf communities, they thrive, and so they find a way to communicate. And so Trinidad and Tobago sign language emerged naturally, even within that kind of oppressive environment. But of course, that has changed now. The schools for the deaf really support the use of sign communication, and we're very happy to see that because evidence shows that works to allow deaf people to accomplish all that they can accomplish.
But no, man, take me back a little bit, please, Dr. Skerrit. So at School for the Deaf, you're saying that individuals were not allowed to use sign language?
Yes. So this started as an influence coming from the very first deaf education conference held in Italy, almost 145 years ago. At that conference in Milan, it was decided that sign language was to be banned in educational settings. And of course, that influenced what took place in deaf education the world over. So that led to real problems, deprivation of access to quality education, minimal equality in life with deaf citizens all over the world, and Trinidad was affected by that thinking at the time, that kind of deficit thinking. And I was shocked to learn about it.
Yeah, but you see my face. But this actually carries me back to two things. One, the way that communities can have similar experiences sometimes, but still feel isolated within their communities if there isn't that inter-community communication. It also sends me to some of the work currently being done by the Bar Academy of Trinidad and Tobago, and I'm trying to remember the community of deaf and hard of hearing that deal with sign, because and I think it's also Patois is the third one, that they're coming together to do some work, because there's some words in terms like having a sign, or as opposed to having to spell it out, for things like Moko Jombi and other things that are intrinsic and endemic to the culture of Trinidad and Tobago. So basically having us being able to shape our world by being able to name and claim it like that. But take me further, please, because I hear July, I hear November. What are some of the things, well, what are the things happening in those time periods?
So the 24th International Congress on the Education of the Deaf, it's abbreviated ICED 2025, is going to be held in Rome, Italy. As you know, Rome is a very historic city, one of the most historical cities in the world. It's very cosmopolitan, metropolis with a vibrant cultural, artistic, and academic life. So it's a really ideal setting for this conference. I am privileged to attend the university has kindly agreed to support my attendance financially, and I'm happy for that. Because this historic conference is where they're going to be bringing together evidence, scientific evidence that deaf education and all of the supports, sign language, works for deaf people, language therapy, linguistics, sociology, audiology, psychology, medicine, all the various aspects that support education, how it can work to remove all of the barriers. So you'll have researchers, teachers, administrators, parents, and professionals from all those fields coming together to share what the evidence says is working to allow deaf people to thrive. The conference for ICED 2025 is more than words. And what they're really doing is that they believe it's time to go beyond words and to advise the need for scientific evidence to support the educational choices that are given to deaf people and that deaf people can make for themselves. And that's a very important concept. Using the voice in the language that deaf people prefer, whether it's spoken and or signed, not being polarized to one or the other. So that's a big thrust of the conference in Rome this year.
How does that conference impact what may be happening in November?
So, well, having the privilege of attending, I'm hoping to bring back a lot of those things and to meet a lot of the presenters there and try to encourage them to register for our conference. We have the current abstract deadline is June 30th, but we're likely going to extend that to the end of July to allow for individuals that would be at the conference in Rome to be able to register and attend the conference here in November. We already have people from all over the world submitting abstracts to our conference. And we have some very critical keynote speakers. First of all, our conference theme is titled Pathways to Inclusive Education and Human Rights for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing, Empowering Change in the Caribbean and Beyond. I slowed that down to support the interpreter because that's a mouthful. So I'll just repeat that. Pathways to Inclusive Education and Human Rights for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing, Empowering Change in the Caribbean and Beyond. The conference is scheduled for November the 6th to the 9th, and it includes 2 full days of conference presentations, a Saturday where we'll have a number of workshops, and we really want to have the workshops on Saturday so that deaf parents, deaf individuals, and even all the teachers will be able to attend and benefit from the practical workshops in the areas of sign language, advocacy for the deaf, and so many other areas that will be targeted. Our sub-themes for the conference involve areas such as inclusive practices in deaf education, professional development for educators and support staff, literacy development for deaf learners, and that's the biggest concern. Advocacy and legislation for deaf rights. As you know, unlike in other countries, we don't have even sign language as a national language right now. So language rights for the deaf is a very key thing. When a country recognizes its sign language as a national sign language, that does so much to promote deaf rights. Crisis management and disaster preparedness. We've done a lot in Trinidad and Tobago in support of that, but that will be a focus. Lessons learned from COVID-19, sign language access and interpretation, and the 2 other areas addressing gender issues in the deaf community and exploring deaf identity. So looking at cochlear implants, speech therapy, language use along the way. So it's going to be an exciting conference.
And you say that, and there's so much that is going to be discussed. I want us to take a little break now, and when we come back, I want to dive into some of the individual topics that you would have raised in terms of themes, tropes, points of focus of the conference. We are speaking with Dr. Paulson Skerrit. We are being ably assisted by Mr. Terence Gopaul, and we return to the conversation after this. Welcome back. We are having a conversation with Dr. Paulson Skerrit, looking at, and I don't know if you want to call it more than words, but definitely sign language conferences and how they can move progress forward in Trinidad and Tobago. One of the things I wanted to ask, though, Dr. Skerrit, is it a matter of, I wonder sometimes, is it more rights for deaf and hard of hearing, or is it a matter of society being able to better, one, facilitate, and thereby being able to benefit from that investment into the community that is deaf and hard of hearing? Because who does it help? Does it help that individual more, or does it help the society more?
Yeah, those are two interesting perspectives, but I think a focus on the rights and ensuring the legal frameworks are there is helpful, because when society does its cost-benefit analysis, issues of the amount of investment and those kinds of things become real questions. Sometimes governments have limited budgets, but when rights are established, then those questions are dealt with differently, because if you have laws stating that these services should be available to the deaf or must be available to the deaf, then persons who are budget holders and who have to decide, is this an investment, or are we going to get returns on this investment? They're more willing to respect the rights of individuals and the community without considering, is this going to benefit me, and what about the cost of this investment? So I think the idea of focusing on the rights, because then it ensures that the people who make the decisions, even if they are not personally affected, they're concerned about doing the right thing. And like you mentioned, this ICDE 2024 More Than Words is going to delve into a number of areas. Just for our conference, they're going to be looking at more than words across language and culture, between research and practice, empowering deaf professionals, school programs and school settings, mental health and quality of life for the deaf, accessibility, social inclusion. Like us, they're looking at supporting deaf identity, bilingual education, one of the buzzwords in deaf education, and language acquisition. So I'm looking forward to benefiting. I've already identified 3 keynotes I'm excited about. I'd like to just mention them quickly. At that conference, there will be a keynote by Dr. Mulder. It's our rhythm, academic becoming, and realignment in deaf space. And she's going to be dealing with one of those issues that bother deaf people, that oftentimes, even though they have their doctorates and their master's and bachelor's degree, or they might be really good linguists, and they come into space, an academic space, they're often being accommodated rather than it being a designated deaf academic space where you have deaf ways of knowing, teaching, communicating, being centered rather than being accommodated. But I'm excited to learn about that, because I've heard deaf people who work with us down here make that kind of feel just being accommodated. And there's another one that I want to go to attend, breaking the glass ceiling. What happened to children after establishing early hearing detection intervention? Now, we have been advocating for that, national early detection of hearing loss. Right now, it's not what it should be. They only screen those children universally who are at risk. I always thought we had universal screening, but that doesn't exist. They have to be at risk. And the many deaf children, they're not in the at-risk category, because a lot of deaf children, their deafness is not because of comorbidities, other disabilities. It's simply the fact that they've lost their hearing. So what her presentation will do is analyze that even when you have those greater obstacles, deaf people don't have to have a glass ceiling in terms of what they could accomplish. That while early diagnosis and earlier intervention plays a dramatic role, there are other pathways to successful outcomes. And that appeals to me, because I've been on the bandwagon for diagnosis and early intervention. But she's going to be exposing a kind of a cautionary tale about setting limitations on families and children who are deaf and hard of hearing because of those what people call greater obstacles. So I'm excited for that.
More obstacles. One of the things I like to do is to have the sign language interpreter who is facilitating the conversation weigh in a little bit. Mr. Terence, we have enough sign language interpreters in Trinidad and Tobago at this point in time?
Well, I want to say no. The answer I will say is no. We need more sign language interpreters to facilitate the deaf. You know, for example, if they need to maybe enter an organization for some kind of service, you know, there's a more need for interpreters, as well as schools. We haven't yet talked about schools, you know, so there's a lot more needed in Trinidad and Tobago.
And that's one of the things I try to do as well, in the sense that just how can it make sense for somebody? What's in it for me? So even if you have somebody thinking about next steps or career choices, what is the process like to become a sign language interpreter? What are some of the things that you need to know? Because even like you said something just now, Dr. Skerrit, and it made me smile because it kind of tells what side of the fence you're on. Because I've heard conversations about whether or not it is that someone has lost hearing or gained deafness, and even like those sorts of things. And there is great space and opportunity for oversight if you don't have somebody who is in the community helping to guide the conversation and narrative, because sometimes the road to hell paved with good intentions. So say, yes, let's do this for this community, but the community itself being a part to help guide the conversation also helps so much.
You're right. We do need, so the path to interpreting, most interpreters locally now are what we call language skilled interpreters. They've grown up with the deaf, they're part of associated with deaf community. They've developed their sign language skills, and through practice, develop their interpreting skills. Ideally, a person should be trained as an interpreter. UWI, the Department of Modern Languages and Linguistics, I think Dr. Benjamin Braffett is the one who coordinates that program. It's called the Diploma in Caribbean Sign Languages. And it is an interpreting program because there are courses in the program, in addition to Caribbean Sign Languages, some courses in linguistics. You do courses on interpreting, both theoretically driven course as well as one that is practice-based. And persons are assessed in the program by what is called an SLPI. So they have deaf people who will be looking at them and assessing their interpreting abilities. So that is really an ideal pathway. That way you become familiar with all of the ethical considerations associated with interpreting, because interpreters need to follow a code of ethics. So I think that's ideal, but many of the interpreters we have now, as Terence says, it's not sufficient to address the needs. And so we need more people trying to take up that program, ensure there's a cohort so the program can be run. Because I think that has been the problem in recent years. We're not getting sufficient people coming forward to get the training to become sign language interpreters.
But just before we go though, give us information, please, because yes, we spoke about deadlines for registration, and we know the date that it's supposed to be happening. But how do people register? How do people put forward work in terms of like saying, okay, well, this is the presentation that I want to do, that sort of information, and just get more information about it, please. So
the Caribbean Deaf Education Conference has a website, and it's pretty easy to remember. It's the usual https:// it's CaribbeanDeafEdConference.com, CaribbeanDeafEdConference.com. And on that website, you'll find the conference theme, the sub-themes, the abstract submission form. As we said, the current deadline is June 30th, but because we'd like to get some of the persons who would have attended the conference in Rome to consider also attending our conference, we will be extending the deadline to July 31st. The conference languages will be both English and Trinidad and Tobago Sign Language, American Sign Language, and if presenters from other countries wish to use their own native sign language, they will be allowed to provide a sign language interpreter either through Zoom or to bring their interpreter with them. The registration fees are amazing. So for me, whenever I attend conference involving sign language interpreting, deaf education, or even deafness, like the conference I went to South Korea last year or 2 years ago, those conferences are very expensive. Even this conference, I paid 1,100 euros just to register for this conference. Our conference fees are reasonable because we want people to be there and not to have to struggle. So we have fees for Caribbean residents that range from 200 US for university researchers to 75 US for students and deaf community members. And non-Caribbean residents are paying university researchers 300 US to the students and deaf community members $100 US. Nowhere in the world would you get conference fees like this. And we have some very important keynote speakers. Claudia Gordon, whose name you might be familiar with, she was the first Black deaf female attorney in the United States, and she worked for President Obama and his successor. Professor Christine Snodden, who does a lot of work on Carnival in Trinidad and Tobago and deaf, she's going to be one of our keynote speakers. Dr. Kimberly Walbers, who was my advisor for my PhD at the University of Tennessee, was one of the people responsible for the Miskiwit study, was done in Trinidad, that led to the establishment of Student Support Services in the Ministry of Education. She's going to be, as well as an assistant professor in the Department of Education at Gallaudet University, the only deaf university in the world. She's one of our keynote speakers. So we have some powerhouses who'll be giving those keynote addresses, plus the many other presentations, posters, and workshops that we'll be having. So November 6th to 9th, 2025 at the School of Education, Trinidad and Tobago is where the conference, Caribbean Deaf Ed Conference, will be happening.
With that, we want to thank you, gentlemen, Dr. Paulson Skerrit, Mr. Terence Gopaul, and this has been In Depth with me, Dike Rostant, on behalf of the entire team here at TTT. Thank you so much for joining us.